President Donald Trump has issued a direct ultimatum to NATO allies. He says the United States will only impose what he calls major new sanctions on Russia if all NATO nations agree to do the same and stop buying oil from Moscow. In a letter he posted to his social media platform, Trump told NATO leaders that continued purchases of Russian oil by some members are shocking, and that these transactions weaken the alliance's negotiating position against the Kremlin. He added that NATO's commitment to winning the war in Ukraine has been far less than 100%, and that collective action is the only way to force Russia to the negotiating table. Trump's demands go beyond sanctions. He is also calling for NATO countries to impose tariffs of between 50% and 100% on Chinese goods, with the promise that these tariffs would be fully withdrawn once the war in Ukraine ends. According to Trump, China has a strong control over Russia, and such tariffs would break that grip, accelerating an end to what he calls a deadly but ridiculous war. This approach marks a significant escalation in linking trade policy with wartime strategy, and it raises questions about whether NATO members, many of whom have deep economic ties to China, would be willing to take such steps. European Union members have already banned most maritime imports of Russian oil and refined products, but exemptions remain for certain countries, and some NATO members outside the EU, such as Turkey, continue to buy Russian crude. Analysts note that Trump's ultimatum effectively targets these remaining buyers and seeks to close the gap in sanctions enforcement that allows Russia to keep earning energy revenue. However, critics warn that imposing sweeping tariffs on China could trigger a trade war, potentially harming NATO economies without guaranteeing a shift in Russia's position. Before we continue, what's your take on this strategy? Would a united NATO oil embargo and high tariffs on China really bring Russia to the table? Or could it backfire economically on the alliance? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read them all. And if you value clear, fact-driven geopolitical updates without the noise, hit subscribe now. NENC Media Group, new videos every other day. Returning to the developments, Trump has already acted unilaterally in some cases, recently doubling tariffs on India to 50% over its continued purchases of Russian oil. A move he acknowledged has caused a rift with New Delhi. India has called the measure unjustified, pointing out that other nations also maintain energy trade with Moscow. European officials, meanwhile, have signaled reluctance to adopt Trump's full plan, particularly the tariff component, arguing that such measures are not their preferred tool for foreign policy pressure. The timing of Trump's ultimatum is notable. It comes after his August meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin in Alaska, talks that raised hopes for a breakthrough, but ultimately produced no agreement. Since then, fighting in Ukraine has continued, with Russian forces launching new drone and missile attacks, and Ukrainian units holding defensive lines while conducting limited counterattacks. Trump's critics argue that delaying US sanctions until NATO aligns with his conditions could give Moscow more time to consolidate gains. Supporters counter that only unified action will have the necessary impact to change Russia's calculus. From a strategic perspective, the proposal ties together three pressure points: energy revenue, trade leverage over China, and alliance unity. If NATO were to fully stop buying Russian oil, it would close one of the last major revenue streams funding the war. If tariffs on China were imposed collectively, it could strain Beijing's economic relationship with Moscow, potentially reducing its willingness to provide indirect support. And if all of this were done in concert, Trump argues the war could end quickly. Though many experts caution that Moscow's decision-making is influenced by more than just economic pressure. For now, it remains unclear whether NATO will adopt any part of Trump's ultimatum, or whether the US will move ahead with its own sanctions regardless of Allied consensus. What is certain is that the proposal has injected new tension into transatlantic discussions, highlighting the ongoing debate over how best to pressure Russia while managing the economic fallout for NATO members. This is NENC Media Group. New geopolitical and military updates every other day. Stay informed, and I'll see you in the next one.